Hello, I'm Susan Marsden and I'm telling the story of the olives in Burnside for our history series of videos. And I'm starting with a bonsai olive, but it's a very characteristic sort of a tree. It originates in the Mediterranean region, a climate very similar to South Australia's, and it's probably been cultivated for up to 7,000 years. The British who annexed South Australia in the 1830s were very familiar with the Mediterranean climate and knew that plants like the olive would do very well in South Australia. And in fact, the first governor and his private secretary, Governor Hindmarsh and George Stephenson, both brought olives out with them to South Australia on the Buffalo in 1836. And Stephenson established a nursery in North Adelaide. So some of the earliest olives were there, and from there were taken out and planted elsewhere. And amongst those earliest olives were many olives planted in Burnside. It was one of the biggest producers of olives and olive oil. So here we are at Beaumont House on Glenburn Road, owned by the National Trust of South Australia, and there are tours here of the house and the garden. Beaumont House was built on land that was bought by Sir Samuel Davenport, who created the village of Beaumont in 1848. The house itself was built for the bishop, the Anglican bishop, in the late 1840s, early 1850s. But meanwhile, Samuel Davenport and his wife, Samuel had come out in the 1840s, having travelled in the south of France, and like other British arrivals in South Australia, he was conscious of the fact that almond vines and olives grew very well in this climate, and he became a great advocate for olive growing in South Australia. And so when he moved from the country where he'd made a lot of money, like early pastoralists did and early farmers, he started to plant olives here. Here we are still at Beaumont House, and behind me you can see these beautiful 140-year-old olive trees, which the National Trust's volunteers and gardeners have had pruned, as you can see, to make them productive. If you look closely, you can see lots of olives in the trees. But as part of the heritage management of the olive, people also love the olives in the background which haven't been pruned and which form something of an enchanted forest in the National Trust garden. I was once exploring my own neighbourhood and I found a narrow little path off Inverness Avenue, and when I walked through it I came upon this beautiful, magical remnant olive plantation. And this is actually the Davenport Olive Reserve off John Cleland Avenue or Inverness Avenue at the top. And these actually date back to the 1840s, the olive truncheons, but they were planted for Sir Samuel Davenport in about 1864. Here we are also on Davenport land. Davenport's land actually extended from Glenburn Road down to Devereux Road, across to Dashwood and across to Cooper, which is actually just beyond these houses here. Here is Greengate. The interesting thing about it, which is lovely, and is a characteristic often of Burnside, is a lot of the old trees were retained, including some of the gum trees, but also, as you can see behind me, a number of the olives from the olive plantation, the old olives. And several of the gardens here have kept quite beautifully these very old olive trees. In Hazelwood Park, we have a nice example of the management challenges of cultural artefact like the olive, which has become a woody weed. Samuel Davenport's prediction that tens of thousands of olives should be established here has borne fruit, so to speak. But what has happened is, and here this is First Creek running through Hazelwood Park, and you can see along the creek a whole lot of little olive trees, which the council has allowed to stay. The management plan, Hazelwood Park is this wonderful natural and cultural artefact, a big reserve, which, as you can hear, has a lot of wildlife, a lot of trees that were introduced, including some of the avenues of gum trees, and this little olive grove here kept in the centre of Hazelwood Park. But the management plan says keep these olives here on the northern side of First Creek, but remove the woody weeds as they reintroduce themselves along the banks of the creek in Hazelwood Park. They are very important as the relics of colonisation in South Australia. I've been talking about the use of olives for all kinds of purposes. For thousands of years, the oil was mostly used medicinally. There were Fauldings in South Australia produced medicinal olive oil, as well as lamp oil, and for cooking, as well as eating the olives themselves. And the timber is beautiful too. And I am lucky enough to have been presented by Burnside Council a few years ago, with a bowl made from olive wood taken from the prunings of the olives at Beaumont House, which we visited. Also, we talked about feral olives and the uses that might be made with them. It might be from timber, but also I've been digging them up occasionally, some of Burnside's feral olives, and making them into the most beautiful, ancient-looking bonsai with these wonderful, typical olive bowls, as the Japanese say, B-O-L-E-S. And they're almost indestructible, which is not a good thing when it comes to actually trying to get rid of them, but it's a good thing if you are using them in your plantations or in your bonsai. So that's it for today from me. Thank you.